Hey guys, so today's video is hopefully going to be something helpful for you, whether you are a project panner or you're just trying to get the most out of your makeup. We're going to be breaking down how long it takes to use up various base makeup products, specifically how many uses it takes to get through those products, and also the cost per use. And this video is totally inspired by the series that my friend Too Much Tash does. She has a series of this kind of video on her channel that she's been doing for the past probably 2 or 3 years at this point. She has a whole playlist of these that I will link below, but she breaks down the number of uses and the cost per use of all sorts of different makeup and skincare products. Super helpful, and I found it so helpful that it inspired me to create my own video like this. Now I will say that my calculations are not going to be quite as exact as Tash's because she tracks her uses for all of her makeup products as soon as she opens them and starts using them. I have not been quite that diligent, but I do track all of my uses for my project pan items once that item is rolled into my project pan. So all the products that we're going to talk about today were in my project pan at some point, and what I was able to do was kind of extrapolate the total number of uses for that product based on how much was left when I rolled it into my project pan. So let's say I start panning something when I have half of it left. I take the number of uses it took to get through half of it and double that to get the estimated total number of uses for that product. So even though my numbers are estimates, hopefully it'll still be helpful. So let's go ahead and get on into the products. I have 8 products to talk about today. Let's start with the primers. One of them is a very glowy primer and the other is more of like a pore refining primer. So the glowy primer is the CoverGirl Vitalist Go Glow Luminizing Lotion. This was in my 2020 project pan, and when I rolled this into my project pan, I really hadn't used it a whole lot. It was basically full, but I know I'd used it a handful of times, so I'm estimating that I'd used it about 10 times before rolling into my project pan. The number of uses that I tracked from the time that it entered my project pan until it was finished was 65 uses, and so I'm just going to add 10 to that to get the estimate of the total number of uses. So that means that the total number of uses that I got out of that primer was 75. And in order to calculate the cost per use of each of these items, I just went ahead and used the original retail price. Some of them I'm sure I got on sale. I usually don't pay full price for things, but just for the sake of calculating the cost per use, we're going to use the original retail value. Now the CoverGirl Go Glow primer seems to actually be discontinued, although it still is available on Walmart's website for around $6. So that's the price that I used for the cost per use calculation, and with that price and 75 uses, that brings the cost per use to 8 cents per use. The other primer that I have is the Jordana Pore Refining Primer, and this one is interesting because this does come with less product than a standard primer. So the CoverGirl Glowy Primer came with a standard 1 fluid ounce or 30 milliliters of primer in it, and this one only comes with 0.68 fluid ounces or 20 milliliters. So significantly less product in here. This one I actually just used up in my current project pan. When I rolled it in, I started right about here. And it's hard to tell exactly, but based on how much I know I'd already used and how much was left in here when I started, I'm estimating that I had used up about 1/4 of the primer before rolling into my project pan. So throughout my project pan, throughout the 2 months that it was in my project, I used it 63 times. And estimating that I'd already used 1/4 of this tube up before that, that means that in total, this primer came with 84 uses, which is actually almost 10 more uses than the CoverGirl primer, which is interesting because this, again, comes with much less product. With this one, since it is more of a pore refining primer, I would use a much smaller amount of it than I would of the CoverGirl Glowy Primer. With the Glowy Primer, I would just put that all over my face. With this one, I would mainly target it in like my pore areas and my T-zone. So that is why I guess I got more uses out of this one. The cost of this one was $6, so that means that the cost per use was about 7 cents, which is just 1 cent under the CoverGirl primer, even though this again comes with less product. So that is going to of course vary from person to person depending on how big your face is or how much of primers you like to use at a time. Interesting though that I got more applications of the primer that had less product in it to begin with. Alright, so next we have 2 different foundations, and they are both very different coverage levels. The first one is actually a tinted moisturizer, and it is the Balm Shelter Tinted Moisturizer. Now this one was in my project pan for most of 2020. This one took me a really long time to pan. That probably is due to the fact that this tinted moisturizer comes with more than double what your standard foundation comes with. So this tinted moisturizer has 2.15 fluid ounces or 64 milliliters in a tube. So it's gonna give you a great bang for your buck. Throughout the 9 months that this was in my project pan, I used it 107 times in order to finish it. And again, I'm estimating that I had already used about a quarter of it up before that. It was still pretty full, but I know I had it in my collection for a while. I just wasn't like focusing on it until I put it into my project pan. So that means that my estimated total number of uses was 143, which is a lot. That's a lot of applications to get out of one tube of any foundation, I think. And that tinted moisturizer retails for $25, which means that the cost per use was around 17 cents. And I actually remember buying that product half off, so that means that my cost per use was actually more like 8 or 9 cents per use, which is really good. That's like a drugstore price. Next, we have another foundation. This is more of a medium coverage one, and this is interesting because I actually have used up 2 of these in 2 different project pans, and it is the Physicians Formula Healthy Foundation. This is a little bit of a spoiler if you are following along with my current project pan, but this is just about finished. I did take the stopper out and scraped everything out of it, and I put the rest of it into a little jar, and I am guessing I have about 4 uses left in that. So this actually got really confusing because, like I said, I've used up 2 of these in 2 different project pans. So I have data on 2 bottles of this foundation, which is really helpful. But just wait until you hear how different my calculations were for these. So I used up this one in 2021, and I also used up one of them in 2019. So let's talk about the 2021 bottle first. So when I put this into my 2021 project pan, I marked that I was right about here, which is about 2/3 of the product left. A month after that, I was all the way down here. And now, about a month later, it's empty. It's weird because when I made those marks, I was pretty certain that I was able to see a line where the product had kind of settled. Now this is kind of an interesting packaging because it does have a stopper and a doe foot applicator, so there was definitely some foundation kind of coating the sides, but I was still, once I left it sitting upright for a long time, I was able to see right about where the level of the product was. Anyway, so since January, I have used this really about 40 times, but then I'm adding on 5 uses for the amount that hasn't been used yet. I think I have probably about 4 or 5 uses left. So that means I will have used this 45 times to get from here to the end. So that means that there was about 1/3 of the product already used up before that, which means our estimated total number of uses for this one bottle was 68 uses. So keep that 68 number in the back of your mind now. In 2019, I rolled this same foundation into my project pan in June, and I started with about half of the foundation remaining. I had marked it right about at the halfway point. And I didn't finish it until the end of November, beginning of December update. So that means it took me about 5 to 6 months to finish half of one of these foundations. Yet it took me 2 months to finish 2/3 of the foundation. In 2019, it took me 57 uses to get from what I thought to be the halfway point to the end. So we'll multiply that times 2 to get our estimated total number of uses for that bottle, which was 114. So 114 uses for my 2019 bottle of Healthy Foundation, 68 uses in my 2021 bottle. It's the same size, the same amount, 1 fluid ounce. I'm thinking what happened was kind of a combination of a few different things. Number one, I think it's possible that this year in 2021, I am just maybe using more foundation than I did back then. Maybe I'm trying to get a little bit more coverage these days than I did back then. I don't feel like I've been using like a crazy amount over these past 2 months to go through this so quickly. I really actually was very surprised that I went through it as quickly as I did. Whereas maybe in 2019, I was just using less of it. Maybe I didn't need as much coverage or want as much coverage back then. So that could be part of it. I also think that maybe, I do remember in 2019 it being very hard to see exactly where I was. And I felt like this time, it was settling at the bottom a lot more easily. So it's possible that I actually had way more of it left than I thought I did back then in 2019 when I made that mark at the halfway point. So that was all very confusing, and I think there were a few different possible factors at play there. But what I ended up doing to get the total number of uses for a bottle of Physicians Formula Healthy Foundation was I just took the average between the 2019 bottle and the 2021 bottle, and that comes out to 91 uses per bottle, which I think sounds about right, especially because with the Balm Shelter Tinted Moisturizer, that one was 143, and that did come with like double the product. And I think with a tinted moisturizer, I would use a little bit more product per application than I would of like a medium coverage foundation. So I think that does kind of add up. I'm not sure why my numbers were so different one year versus the other. So next I have one concealer, and it is the CoverGirl Vitalist Healthy Concealer. This was also in my 2019 project pan, so it's been a while since I've used this one up. But I was able to go back and look back at my number of uses that I had tallied, and I was also able to see how much I had left when I started. So this was really nice because this is one of those concealers that's like a twist up pen, so there's like a window where you can see exactly how much product you have left. So when I rolled this into my 2019 project pan, I had used up about 2/3 of it already because there was just about 1/3 left in the window that I could see. And it took me 31 uses to use up that amount in my project pan. And so estimating that I had about 1/3 of it remaining when I started panning it, that means that the total number of uses for that concealer was right around 93 uses. And this concealer seems to have a few different prices depending on the retailer, but on Walmart's website it is currently going for $8, so that's the number that I used for the value, and that means that our cost per use was 9 cents per use. And it's interesting, a lot of these drugstore products are hovering right around the 7, 8, 9, 10 cents per use range. So I guess that's a pretty standard cost per use for drugstore products. I'm not sure. It sounds like a lot though. Like imagine throwing out like a dime every time you use one of your drugstore products. I mean, that really does add up. So interesting. Okay, next we have a powder. And this is something that took me so ridiculously long to use up in my 2020 project pan. I still have the packaging here. This is the Physicians Formula Healthy Powder. So another product from their Healthy line. The Healthy line is now, I think, discontinued. You can still find it at a few places. Also, I know some people don't consider Physicians Formula to be cruelty-free. To me, they're kind of in like the gray area. So anyway, just FYI there. But this is their Healthy Powder, and it took me a really long time. It took me 6 months from the time that I put this into my project pan until I used it up. And when I put this in my project pan, I really had not used it very much before that. I'm estimating that I had used it about 15 times prior to putting it into my project pan. It may have been 10 times, it may have been 20 times, you know, somewhere in that range, but we're just gonna go ahead and say 15. And also keep in mind that with powder, I don't have oily skin at all, so I use a pretty small amount of powder when I use it all over my face. Actually, nowadays I don't even really put powder all over my face, but when I was using this, I was just doing like a light dusting all over my face. So in the 6 months that I had this in my project pan from the time I rolled it in till the time it was used up, I used it 133 times. And then again, estimating that I had used it about 15 times before that, the total number of uses that I got out of this powder was 148, which is a lot. That sounds like a lot of uses, right? Although this is a pretty expensive powder. The original like retail price of this was $15 or like $14.99. And so that means that our cost per use was 10 cents per use, which actually I feel like is kind of a lot considering how many uses I got out of this. Like I would guess that me getting so many uses out of a product, the cost per use would be lower, but I guess since this was a pretty expensive powder to begin with, that does make sense. Okay, so lastly, I have 2 setting sprays to talk about, and I actually have both of the bottles here. I have the Pixi Glow Mist and the NYX Dewy Finish Setting Spray. So these are both kind of glowy setting sprays, but they're very different kinds of glowy setting sprays. So the Pixi Glow Mist is a very hydrating mist, and it actually can look really oily if you apply too much of it because there are actual like oils in here. Whereas the NYX Dewy Finish Setting Spray gives you a very dewy finish, but it actually feels more like your typical setting spray. It doesn't feel very hydrating. It actually almost feels like it kind of sets down your makeup, almost a little bit drying. So very different formulas. And the Pixi Glow Mist comes with more product than the NYX setting spray. I mean, you can see just based on the size here. Pixi comes with 2.7 fluid ounces or 80 milliliters. And the NYX Dewy Finish Setting Spray comes with 2.03 fluid ounces or 60 milliliters. So you're getting like a third less product in the NYX setting spray. So with the Pixi Glow Mist, I had this in my project pan for quite a while, and it took me 79 uses to use up just about half of this bottle. So just gonna multiply that times 2 to get the total number of uses. So our estimated total number of uses for this bottle is 160. This setting spray is actually kind of pricey for the drugstore. It's $15, and so our cost per use is 9 cents. Once again, a lot of these cost per uses were very close, even across like different categories of products. And then with the NYX Dewy Finish Setting Spray, I had started my project pan right about here, which means, again, that I had about 2/3 left when I started. In my project pan, I used it 60 times, and so that means our estimated total number of uses for this whole bottle is 90 uses. The cost of this setting spray is $8.50, which is much cheaper than the Pixi Glow Mist, but our cost per use was actually just about the same. This was 9 cents per use, same as the Pixi. So I think that with the NYX Dewy Finish Setting Spray, this is just one that I would use a lot more of at a time. Also, maybe it depends on the spray nozzle. Maybe one of them lets out more spray at a time than the other. I get pretty heavy-handed with setting spray regardless of the formula, but it is interesting to know that the cost per use of these was the same, even though one of them comes with significantly more spray than the other. So that is where I think this kind of video gets really interesting, is because it tells you a lot more than just the cost per ounce. It's very easy to calculate the cost per ounce without knowing how much value you're actually getting out of the product based on the number of uses that you get. So those are all 8 of the products that I wanted to talk about today, just focusing on base products. I would love to continue doing this kind of video in the future once I have more information that I've gathered. But once again, make sure to check out Tash's channel. She's done a ton of these. That's where I got the inspiration for this one. But if you enjoyed this video, I'd love to have you stick around. I upload 2 to 3 times per week, and so I'd love to see you again very soon, and hopefully I'll talk to you in my next video. Bye.